When John stepped off the plane in Texas, the world thought his war was over. But in the shadows of his quiet hometown, another war was waiting, one far deadlier. Texas, late 1940s. In a small town tucked between cotton fields and cattle ranches, John came into the world. He grew up in a working-class family, his father a mechanic, his mother a homemaker. His childhood was marked by dusty afternoons playing football with neighborhood kids, fishing by the riverbanks, and summer nights filled with the hum of cicadas. Raised in the shadow of World War II's triumph, John absorbed the stories of sacrifice and glory. Veterans in his town, decorated with medals, welcomed as heroes, etched lasting impressions on the boy. He dreamed that one day he too would march proudly down Main Street in uniform, bringing honor to his family. But life in small-town Texas wasn't easy. Jobs were scarce, and John, with average grades and limited prospects for college, faced a narrow future. By his final years of high school, he stood at a crossroads, remain stuck in low-wage labor, or carve out another path. Across America, amid the tensions of the Cold War, recruiting posters promised young men adventure, training, and a chance to serve something greater than themselves. To John, those posters were both an invitation and an escape. He often told his friends, "If I stay here, I'll spend my life in factories or fields. But in the Marines, I can learn, I can travel, I can matter." At 18, his eyes burned with ambition, restless for a destiny beyond the borders of his dusty hometown. So John enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. It was a choice shaped by youthful optimism and a streak of recklessness, fueled by the belief that the uniform could lift him from obscurity into purpose. He had no idea that this decision would carry him across the world, to a land called Vietnam, where dreams of glory would be tested in ways he could never have imagined. The letter came with official weight, orders to report for training. For John, it was both a thrill and a jolt of reality. He had imagined the Marines as a gateway to adventure, but holding those papers in his hands made it real. The boy from Texas was now a soldier bound for war. America in the 1960s was a nation caught in contradiction. On the one hand, there was booming prosperity, new highways, televisions in every living room, and the promise of the American dream. On the other, the Cold War's shadow loomed large, and the growing conflict in a distant place called Vietnam had begun to divide the country. Recruitment offices were busy, draft notices were being sent, and young men across America found themselves standing in lines, clutching their futures in nervous hands. For John, enlistment wasn't forced, it was chosen. He stepped into basic training with a mix of pride and fear. The Marines wasted no time reshaping him. Early mornings filled with shouted commands, the sting of blistered hands on obstacle courses, the relentless drilling of discipline into his bones. He learned how to march, how to fire a rifle, how to strip away hesitation until only obedience remained. The bonds of brotherhood began to form quickly. He met boys from New York, from Kansas, from California, farmhands, factory workers, sons of immigrants. Different accents, different backgrounds, but all transformed under the same grueling routine. In the evenings, when exhaustion gave way to quiet moments, they shared stories of home. John spoke of Texas sunsets and Friday night football games. Others spoke of cornfields, city blocks, or beaches. Each man carried a piece of America with him, stitched into the fabric of the unit. Yet beneath the bravado, questions lingered. What exactly were they heading into? In newspapers and on television, Vietnam was portrayed as a necessary stand against communism, but the details were hazy. Some recruits spoke with patriotic certainty, repeating the slogans of the time. Others whispered doubts. Why Vietnam? Why us? John didn't dwell too long on the questions. At 18, he was fueled more by momentum than philosophy. He trusted the uniform, trusted the nation's call. He told himself that whatever awaited them overseas, it would be another test, like the training grounds. Hard, yes, but survivable. Still, on the night before deployment, lying on his bunk with his duffel packed at his side, John stared into the darkness and felt a tremor of unease. The posters had promised honor, travel, a purpose. But in that quiet moment, as the base settled into silence, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into something far larger, far heavier than he had ever imagined. The first thing that hit John when the transport plane doors opened was the heat. Thick, wet, suffocating, unlike anything he had ever felt in Texas. It clung to his uniform, soaked his skin, and carried the sharp scent of jet fuel mixed with jungle earth. The second thing was the noise. The whir of helicopter blades chopping the sky, shouted commands, and the constant hum of an unfamiliar land alive with insects and distant thunder. Stepping off the plane, John and his fellow Marines were met with a blur of activity. Trucks rattled down dusty roads, soldiers hurried with weapons slung over shoulders, and everywhere there was motion, as if the war itself never paused. The men exchanged glances, some wide-eyed with excitement, others tightening their jaws against creeping fear. John tried to steady himself, but the weight of reality pressed harder with every breath. He was no longer training. This was Vietnam. The landscape seemed both beautiful and menacing. Palm trees swayed above sprawling rice paddies that gleamed under the sun, their still waters broken only by the silhouettes of farmers working barefoot. Beyond the paddies stretched jungles so dense they looked impenetrable, a wall of green hiding whatever dangers lurked inside. For a moment, John felt a strange awe, as if he had been dropped into another world entirely. Yet that awe quickly gave way to unease. Warnings spread among the new arrivals. Don't trust the quiet. Don't trust the stillness. The war is everywhere, even when you can't see it. Older soldiers, their faces weathered, moved with a calm that came not from peace, but from constant vigilance. John noticed their eyes, always scanning, always alert, as if danger could erupt at any second. Within days, the camaraderie John had built in training deepened in the field. Nights in the barracks or tents became filled with whispered conversations, nervous jokes, and letters from home read aloud to keep spirits steady. The Marines clung to one another like brothers, because in Vietnam, brotherhood was survival. But there were also moments that unsettled him. The rumble of artillery in the distance, the sudden wail of sirens, or the hollow silence after a patrol returned one man short. Each new sound or absence carved a mark inside him. He began to realize that in this place, life and death could shift in an instant. John wrote his first letter home that week. He tried to keep it light for his parents, telling them about the strange food and the endless humidity, about the guys he met and how they kept each other laughing. But between the lines, what he didn't write, what he couldn't write, was already starting to form a shadow, the creeping sense that Vietnam would not just be a chapter in his life. It would be a weight he would carry forever. The first firefight came before John had even learned the rhythm of patrols. One moment the jungle was alive with cicadas and birdsong. The next it erupted in chaos, gunfire snapping through the trees, men shouting, the ground shaking beneath the concussion of mortars. John dropped low, his training taking over, but nothing in boot camp had prepared him for the sound of bullets tearing through leaves just inches away. Time seemed to twist, stretching seconds into minutes, until at last the gunfire ebbed into an eerie silence. When it was over, John felt the tremor in his hands. A buddy from New York, just days ago cracking jokes about baseball, was gone. The loss was sharp, immediate, and bewildering. John tried to swallow the grief, to hide it behind the hardened mask the Marines demanded. But inside something fragile began to splinter. Days turned into weeks, and the war revealed its true nature. Not constant battle, but constant waiting. Long patrols through the jungle, sweat dripping down his back, nerves wound tight at every rustle in the underbrush. Nights spent awake, staring into the dark, listening for footsteps that might or might not be there. Every day brought the possibility of sudden violence, and every day John learned to live with that gnawing edge of fear. Letters from home arrived sporadically, a lifeline to normalcy. His mother wrote about the changing seasons, his father about fixing cars, friends about dances and football games. John read them by flashlight, the words both comforting and alien. The world he had left felt impossibly distant, like a dream slipping further away. In the brief lulls, the Marines found ways to keep their humanity intact. They traded stories, sang songs off-key, and carved crude jokes into helmets. John laughed with them because laughter was armor. But sometimes, when he was alone, he felt the silence press in and the questions surface. What are we really doing here? What will become of us when this ends? The invisible wounds began to take root. Each firefight etched itself into his memory. Each loss added weight he could not set down. He did not yet have a name for it, but the shadows of fear and grief were already binding themselves to him. When the tour ended, John told himself he was ready to leave it behind. He imagined stepping off the plane in Texas, sunlight on familiar streets, family waiting with open arms. He believed that once he was home, the nightmares would fade, the tension would ease, and the war would shrink into the past. But what John didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the war had no intention of staying behind. It would follow him across the ocean, stitched invisibly into his mind, waiting for the moment to resurface. John's final weeks in Vietnam were a strange blur of exhaustion and anticipation. Each dawn patrol felt heavier, each night's watch longer, as if time itself resisted letting him go. The jungle no longer seemed alien. It had become a cruel companion, one he was eager to leave behind. Yet leaving meant saying goodbye to the men who had stood beside him through fire and fear, brothers bound by survival. When the orders finally came, John felt a rush of relief, tempered by guilt. Relief that he would soon see Texas again. Guilt because some of his closest friends would never make that journey. On his last night, he sat with a few of them in the dim light of a barracks lantern, trading stories they had all told before. They laughed louder than usual, as if to drown out the truth. Tomorrow, one of them was going home, and others were not. The flight out of Vietnam was filled with a restless silence. The roar of the engines couldn't drown out the thoughts hammering in John's mind. He stared out the small window at the fading green of the jungles below, whispering a promise he couldn't voice aloud, that he would never forget those who stayed behind. Touching down on American soil, the atmosphere was jarring. For a brief moment, John allowed himself to believe the worst was over. Families embraced returning soldiers at the airport. Camera flashes sparked, and bands played patriotic tunes. But the welcome was uneven. Some men were cheered, while others, especially those in smaller towns or college cities, were met with stares, muttered words, even open hostility. For John, the first hug from his mother at the arrivals gate felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. His father clasped his shoulder firmly, pride and worry written in his eyes. On that day, he let himself believe that the war was ending, not just for the nation, but for him personally. As he unpacked his duffel bag back in his old Texas bedroom, the familiar smells of home, coffee in the kitchen, oil from his father's workshop, wrapped around him. He thought, this is it. A fresh start. A new chapter. Yet even in those first quiet nights, shadows stirred. Lying in his own bed, he would jolt awake at the faint creak of the house settling, heart racing as if ambush were imminent. Dreams carried him back to the jungle, the gunfire, the faces of men who never returned. He pushed those moments aside, convincing himself they would fade with time. John was home, yes, but the war had followed him, silently, invisibly, across the ocean, and it was only beginning to show its grip. At first glance, everything seemed unchanged. The same dusty roads stretched through John's hometown, the same diner buzzed with chatter, the same Friday night football games lit up the field under the Texas sky. But for John, walking those streets again felt strangely hollow, as if he had stepped into a world that had moved on without him. His family tried to celebrate his return. His mother cooked his favorite meals. His father introduced him proudly as "my boy," back from the Marines. Neighbors shook his hand, but their smiles carried an awkwardness he couldn't quite name. In casual conversations, people avoided asking about Vietnam, or worse, asked questions that cut too close, questions he wasn't ready to answer. Some spoke of the war as if it were a mistake, a stain, and John felt the sting of being judged for having served. Unlike the veterans of World War II, welcomed as heroes, many Vietnam vets came home to silence, even scorn. John noticed it quickly. At the bus station in a nearby city, protesters carried signs, chanting against the war. A few hurled insults at soldiers stepping off buses, calling them baby killers or pawns of politicians. John kept his head down, but the words burrowed deep. He had left Vietnam alive, but now he wondered if he belonged anywhere at all. The hardest part was trying to reconnect with his old life. Friends who had stayed behind were now in college, working steady jobs or starting families. They talked about parties, careers, plans for the future. John listened, nodding politely, but felt like a ghost at the table. When he tried to share his own stories, they didn't know how to respond. His silence grew heavier with each passing week. Nights were the worst. In the quiet of his room, familiar sounds, the wind rattling the window, the creak of floorboards, pulled him back into the jungle. He would wake drenched in sweat, with a heart pounding, convinced for a moment he was under attack. His parents never spoke of it directly, but his mother sometimes found him sitting on the porch before dawn, cigarette glowing in the dark, eyes fixed on something far away. Still, John told himself he could adapt. He was alive, he was home, and that had to mean something. But as the days turned into months, it became clear that returning to Texas did not mean returning to who he once was. The war had carved a distance between him and the world he loved, and he had no map to find his way back. John's first step toward rebuilding his life was finding a job. He polished his boots, cut his hair neat, and carried himself with the posture of a Marine. He walked into the local factory, resume in hand, believing his military service would speak for itself. But the manager glanced over his paperwork, frowned, and muttered something about not the right fit. It was the first of many rejections. Day after day, John tried, at construction sites, warehouses, gas stations. Sometimes the excuse was that he lacked specific skills. Other times the rejection was sharper, unspoken. A suspicion in their eyes when they saw Vietnam on his service record. Employers whispered about veterans being unstable, dangerous, damaged goods. John heard enough of it to realize the rumors weren't just words. They were closing doors in his face. Back in training, the Marines had drilled into him the belief that discipline and loyalty were assets. But here, in civilian life, those qualities seemed invisible. A younger man with no scars from war could secure a job faster than someone who had risked everything overseas. The contradiction gnawed at him. He had survived combat, only to be defeated by application forms and closed doors. The longer he searched, the more isolated he felt. Bills piled up, and pride kept him from asking his parents for help. Friends avoided talking about the war, as if acknowledging it would taint their easy lives. At times, John caught himself rehearsing answers in the mirror, trying to sound normal, to hide the edge in his voice that years of tension had carved. But no amount of practice erased the shadows in his eyes. The weight of rejection sank deeper each week. At the bar, he overheard whispers, stories of other veterans living under bridges, drinking themselves into oblivion, some taking their own lives. John shook his head at first, insisting he would never sink that low. But late at night, lying awake with the silence pressing in, he felt a creeping fear. Maybe he was already on the same path. Finding work was supposed to be simple, the first step toward building a future. Instead, every closed door reminded him that the war had followed him home, not in gunfire or explosions, but in the quiet, invisible ways society had turned its back. For John, the battlefield was gone, yet the fight for survival had only just begun. At first, it was just a drink to take the edge off, a cold beer after another fruitless day of job hunting, or a shot of whiskey to help him fall asleep when the nightmares came. John told himself it was harmless, just a way to calm his nerves. But what began as a crutch quickly grew into a routine, and then into a cage. Nights became longer, lonelier. He sat at the local bar until closing, staring into half-empty glasses, hoping the alcohol would drown out the echoes of Vietnam, the crack of gunfire, the shouts of brothers lost, the silence that followed. For a few hours the liquor dulled the memories, but in the mornings they came back sharper than ever, accompanied by the pounding in his head and the sour taste of regret. Family and friends noticed the change. His mother would wait up, the kitchen light burning late into the night, only to watch her son stumble in with glassy eyes. His father tried to reason with him, reminding him of discipline and strength, but John bristled at the lectures. Arguments flared, doors slammed, and the distance between them widened. Old friends stopped calling, tired of seeing the once lively Marine hunched over a drink, barely recognizing the man they had known. The bottle became his constant companion. It was there when he woke, shaky and restless. It was there when the sun dipped low, urging him back to the bar stool. Routines dissolved, job applications forgotten, days slipping by in a haze. John began to feel as if the world outside no longer wanted him, and the world inside his head was unbearable. The alcohol was the only thing that kept him suspended in between. But with every glass, the isolation deepened. He missed family gatherings, lost touch with the men he had once trained beside, and retreated into a private battlefield only he could see. The war had followed him home, and in the bottom of a bottle, John thought he had found a way to silence it. In truth, the alcohol only amplified the void, pulling him further from the life he once hoped to rebuild. By the mid-1970s, John's life had unravelled into something he barely recognised. Days bled into one another, marked not by work or purpose, but by the burn of whiskey and the dull throb of hangovers. The man who had once carried himself with the crisp discipline of a Marine now spent mornings slouched at the edge of his bed, staring at the floorboards, unsure why he should rise at all. The nightmares grew worse. Some nights he bolted upright, drenched in sweat, hearing the phantom whir of helicopter blades or the snap of unseen gunfire. Other nights he dreamed of faces, friends lost in Vietnam, calling to him from the jungle. When dawn came, the dreams lingered like smoke, filling his chest with a heaviness he couldn't shake. His family's patience thinned. His mother wept quietly, setting breakfast at the table only to watch him ignore it. His father, once proud of his son's service, now watched with a mixture of anger and helplessness. "You survived the war," he said once, voice trembling. "Don't let it kill you now." But John could not explain the invisible grip of trauma. The words caught in his throat, leaving only silence. Relationships outside the family fared no better. Old friends stopped inviting him out, uncomfortable with his unpredictable moods. Prospective employers, if they gave him an interview at all, quickly turned away at the smell of alcohol on his breath. John drifted further into isolation, convinced he was broken in a way no one could understand. Whispers about other veterans reached him. Men sleeping on park benches, lining up at soup kitchens, some even ending their lives when the burden became too much. Each story felt like a mirror of his own decline. John wondered if he was destined for the same fate. One bleak evening, he found himself sitting on the porch alone, a half-empty bottle in his hand. The Texas sky stretched wide above him, streaked with stars, but he saw none of its beauty. All he felt was the emptiness pressing in, a sense that his war had never ended, that he was still lost in a jungle, only now it was inside his own mind. At that lowest point, John began to believe he had no way forward. Vietnam had taken his peace, alcohol had taken his strength, and despair threatened to take everything else. He could not yet imagine that salvation might come, not from within, but from someone who understood the same darkness. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in a place John had drifted through 100 times before. He was sitting at the edge of a bar, glass in hand, the weight of another wasted day pressing down on him. Across the counter, a man struck up conversation. Older, weathered, with the same haunted look in his eyes that John had seen in the mirror. His name was Mike, a fellow Marine who had served in Vietnam a year before John. At first, John barely responded. Small talk felt pointless. But then Mike said something that cut through the fog. "You think you're the only one still fighting that war?" The words hit like a jolt. Mike spoke quietly, but with the authority of someone who had walked the same road, through the nightmares, the drinking, the silence no one else could understand. Mike told John about a group that met once a week at a church basement on the edge of town. Veterans, just like them, gathering not for glory or pity, but simply to speak aloud the things they carried. "You don't have to talk," Mike said. "Just come and listen. You'll see you're not alone." John resisted. The idea of sitting in a circle, spilling his secrets to strangers felt impossible. But the following week, with nothing left to lose, he went. He slipped into the room quietly, half ready to turn and walk out. Yet what he found stopped him. Men sat in folding chairs, some in worn jackets, others in work clothes, their faces lined with the same invisible scars he bore. One after another, they spoke, hesitant at first, then raw and unfiltered. They talked about sleepless nights, about tempers they couldn't control, about jobs lost and families broken. They described dreams so vivid they woke in terror, convinced they were back in the jungle. John listened, frozen, as every word echoed something he had never dared admit aloud. For the first time he realized his pain wasn't madness, and it wasn't weakness, it was shared. When the meeting ended, no one demanded that he speak. A few men clapped him on the shoulder, offering nothing more than a quiet nod, a simple recognition. You belong here. Walking out into the night air, John felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: relief. The war inside him was still raging, but now he knew he wasn't fighting it alone. John returned the next week. He told himself it was just curiosity, but deep down he felt a pull stronger than doubt. This time, when the stories began, he didn't just listen, he spoke. At first, only a few words stumbled out. "I can't sleep. The dreams don't stop." His voice cracked, his hands shook, but the room stayed silent, not in judgment but in recognition. Heads nodded, eyes softened. They understood. Each week, John found himself saying more. He described the sound of helicopters that never left his ears, the face of a friend he lost on patrol, the emptiness of walking back into a world that no longer fit him. In telling his story, he began to loosen the grip of memories that had bound him in silence for years. What had once been unbearable to confess now became a shared burden, lighter each time he let it out. Therapists eventually joined the meetings, introducing words John had never known: post-traumatic stress disorder. The label didn't fix everything, but it gave shape to the shadows inside him. It meant his pain wasn't a personal failure. It was a wound, real and treatable. Slowly, through counselling sessions, breathing exercises and long talks with fellow veterans, John began to rebuild pieces of himself he thought were gone. He cut back on drinking. It wasn't easy. Every day was a battle. But with support, he replaced the bottle with long walks, with conversations, with the simple act of showing up sober to the next meeting. His family, once distant, noticed the change. His mother's worried eyes softened when she saw him eating at the dinner table again. His father, cautious at first, began to speak to him not with frustration, but with pride. The nightmares didn't vanish, but they lost their grip. When they came, John had tools to steady himself: breathing, grounding, the reminder that he wasn't back in Vietnam. And when he stumbled, the group caught him. In their laughter, their tears, their unspoken brotherhood, John rediscovered something he thought he had left in the jungle: the strength of standing shoulder to shoulder with men who understood the fight. Healing was not a straight line. It was jagged, uneven, with steps forward and stumbles back. But for the first time since stepping off the plane from Vietnam, John believed in the possibility of tomorrow. Not a perfect tomorrow, not free of scars, but one where he could live, breathe, and maybe even hope again. Healing gave John something he hadn't felt in years: the faint outline of a future. It began with small victories: waking up without a hangover, making it through a night with fewer nightmares, showing up to meetings week after week. Each step was fragile, but together they formed the foundation of a life he had once believed lost. He started picking up part-time work around town, fixing cars, hauling supplies, odd jobs that didn't require spotless resumes. At first, it was about survival, keeping busy so the dark thoughts didn't creep back in. But soon he rediscovered a sense of pride in honest labor. The grease on his hands, the ache in his muscles, these were struggles he could see and conquer, unlike the invisible battles in his mind. Rebuilding also meant mending ties at home. One Sunday morning, John surprised his mother by sitting beside her at church. She clasped his hand tightly, as if afraid letting go might send him drifting again. His father, quieter than before, offered to work with him on a car engine in the garage. Those long afternoons together, wrenches clinking, silence broken by the hum of tools, became their way of speaking without words, of healing the rift that war had driven through the family. Even relationships beyond family began to shift. Old friends who had once kept their distance cautiously returned. Some still didn't understand his experiences, but they respected his effort to move forward. And John, no longer carrying everything in silence, found he didn't need them to fully understand, only to accept him as he was. Still, not every day was easy. Some mornings he woke with a weight on his chest, the urge to disappear back into a bottle, but he carried with him the lessons of therapy and the steady support of fellow veterans. They had taught him that recovery wasn't about erasing the past, it was about learning to live alongside it. In those quiet moments, working on an engine with his father, sharing coffee with his mother, or simply sitting in the sun outside the garage, John felt something stir that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: the possibility of peace. It was tentative, fragile, but real. For the first time since Vietnam, his life was not defined solely by what he had lost. Slowly, Piece by piece, he was learning what it meant to live again. The group meetings did more than steady John's mind. They gave him back a sense of belonging. Sitting in those folding chairs, listening to voices tremble with stories of nightmares, broken marriages, and sleepless nights, John realized he was part of something bigger, a brotherhood that had survived beyond the battlefield. In time, he became one of the veterans who welcomed newcomers, the quiet figures slipping through the door with wary eyes. He remembered his own hesitation, the weight of silence he had carried, and he knew exactly what to say. "You don't have to talk today. Just listen. You're not alone." Those words, simple as they were, often cracked open walls that years of isolation had built. John and a few of the men began volunteering at shelters, reaching out to homeless veterans who had slipped through the cracks of society. They brought hot meals, blankets, and, more importantly, proof that someone still cared. Each time John met a man curled up beneath a bridge or clutching a bottle in despair, he saw a reflection of who he might have become. Helping them was his way of honoring the second chance he had been given. The camaraderie extended beyond the group. Cookouts with fellow vets, long drives into the countryside, quiet evenings swapping stories, these became John's lifeline. There was a rhythm to it, a balance he had missed since leaving Vietnam. The trust of men who understood without explanation, the kind of bond forged not by blood, but by shared scars. Sometimes they laughed about absurd moments in the war, the terrible rations, the odd songs they sang to keep from losing their minds. Other times, silence hung heavy as memories resurfaced. But whether in laughter or quiet, John felt anchored. The war had taken much, but it had not taken away the one thing that could still hold him up: brotherhood. Through these connections, John began to see himself not just as a survivor, but as a guide. He had stumbled through darkness, but now he could light the way for others. The Marine in him had never truly disappeared. It had only been waiting for a new mission, and now that mission was clear: to stand by his brothers as they had once stood by him. As the years passed, John found himself looking back more often, not just at the war, but at everything that followed. He sometimes sat on the porch at dusk, watching the Texas sun sink into the horizon, the sky streaked with orange and violet. In those quiet moments, the memories surfaced like waves, faces of friends lost in the jungle, the feel of damp earth under his boots, the long nights of silence when home didn't feel like home. He no longer ran from those memories. Instead, he let them come, knowing they were part of him. The war had taken pieces of his youth, stolen years that might have been spent chasing dreams, building a career, starting a family earlier. Yet it had also carved into him a resilience he never knew he possessed. He had endured, even when he believed he could not. John often thought about the men who hadn't made it back. Their laughter, their dreams, their futures, all cut short. That grief had once been a burden too heavy to bear. Now he carried it differently, as a responsibility. He spoke their names aloud at gatherings, told their stories so they would not fade into silence. Remembering them was his way of keeping them alive. At times bitterness crept in. He questioned the purpose of it all, the politics, the protests, the way society had turned its back on those who served. But alongside the bitterness came perspective. He had seen what war did to men, and he had seen what healing required: patience, compassion, and the courage to face pain rather than bury it. The scars were still there, visible only to him. A sudden sound could still send his heart racing. A restless night could still drag him back to the jungle. But those scars no longer defined him. They were reminders, not of weakness, but of survival. Looking at the younger veterans of newer wars, John felt a mix of sorrow and solidarity. He knew the battles they faced would not end on the battlefield. But he also knew that healing was possible, even if imperfect. His own life was proof. In reflection, John understood that the war would always be part of his story, but it was not the whole story. What mattered was what came after: the fight to rebuild, the choice to live, the fragile hope he now guarded like a flame against the wind. By the time John reached his later years, the sharp edges of his memories had softened, though they never disappeared. He still carried the war within him, stitched into his thoughts, his dreams, his scars. But it no longer ruled him. What had once been a constant storm had become more like passing weather, unpredictable, sometimes fierce but survivable. His life settled into rhythms he once thought impossible. Early mornings spent tinkering in the garage. Afternoons sharing coffee with his mother until she passed, her pride in his recovery etched into her final smile. Occasional reunions with fellow veterans where laughter and tears flowed in equal measure. These ordinary moments, so mundane to others, felt extraordinary to John. Each one a quiet victory over the chaos that once consumed him. There were still nights when he woke in a cold sweat, heart pounding as if ambushed by ghosts. There were still days when a sudden noise or a passing smell of diesel jolted him back to the jungles of Vietnam. But now he knew how to ground himself. He breathed, he remembered where he was, and he leaned on the community that had carried him this far. The pain was still there, but it was no longer his alone to bear. Looking into the mirror, John sometimes hardly recognized the old Marine staring back. The lines on his face told stories of survival, not just of war, but of everything after. In his eyes was a light that had been absent for decades, a fragile but undeniable peace. It wasn't the peace he once imagined as a young man heading off to battle, nor the triumphant peace promised by patriotic posters. It was humbler, quieter, but more real. The peace of endurance, of having faced the darkest nights and still being here to greet the dawn. When neighbours asked about his service, John no longer turned away. He spoke softly, without bitterness, sharing what he could. Sometimes he ended with a simple truth. The war never truly leaves you, but neither do the brothers who stood beside you, and that's what keeps you going. In the end, John's story wasn't about defeat or glory. It was about survival, about learning to live with the weight of memory and finding a way to carry it without breaking. His journey was a reminder that even after the longest wars, peace can be found. Not perfect, not complete, but enough to let a man breathe and to let him hope again. John's journey is more than the story of one Marine from Texas. It mirrors the experiences of thousands of Vietnam veterans who came home to a nation unprepared to receive them. Their struggles did not end on the battlefield. They continued in the silence of sleepless nights, in the rejection of job interviews, in the distance of family and friends who could not understand. For many, the war never truly ended. It simply changed shape. Yet within these stories lies a testament to resilience. Men like John carried invisible scars, but through brotherhood, therapy, and sheer determination, many found ways to rebuild. They learned that healing is not the erasure of pain, but the ability to live alongside it, to transform wounds into wisdom and despair into empathy. Their lives remind us that survival is not just about coming home, it is about finding reasons to stay. Today, as newer generations of veterans return from conflicts around the world, John's story carries a quiet lesson. No soldier comes back unchanged, and no soldier should carry that weight alone. Communities, families, and nations have a responsibility to listen, to support, and to honour those who bore the burdens of war. In John's fragile peace, we see both the cost of conflict and the possibility of redemption. His life stands as a reminder that healing is possible. Even when imperfect, that hope can be rebuilt, piece by piece, from the ruins of war.